Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's Patrick Muldoon, and I am here to cover a subject that's kind of had me worried. It's rolled out over the last 2 or 3 weeks. I haven't really discussed it, but I wanted to bring it to the forefront because I do believe that there's some stuff we need to go over. Let me take you back to 2020. If you remember, we were coming into what would be the pandemic. This would have been March of 2020 for me, and then I will bring you up to current times on how I think this affects all of us. 2020, as we know and have been told, was unprecedented times. We had never seen this before. I was sitting at a pub here in Colorado Springs, and I had a group of people around me. We were at what was a Young Professionals Network social, and we were discussing how we were hearing the pandemic was starting to affect different nations, such as Italy, and they were being locked down, and China was being locked down. And I was at this bar. At this point, it seems like none of this is really happening. It's in the background, but we're really not talking about it. And we had the St. Patrick's Day parade coming up. And I remember sitting there hearing from one of my friends that they were going to probably not do the St. Patrick's Day parade because we had the pandemic. And I sat there and probably made one of the silliest comments I would ever make, but did not know it was going to apply until later. And I said, there is no way we are going to be able to close down the entire economy. Americans aren't going to put up with that. They literally are not going to do it. And shortly after that, I found out that they would. Not only would we give up our freedoms, but we would give up a lot of things. We would be told that our businesses would not be able to be open despite leaving certain businesses open. But the one thing that caught me off guard the most was freedom of speech during this time period. Social media, as we know now, was being manipulated by our government. But at that time, we really didn't know that. Some people thought it might be, but we didn't really know that for sure. However, we would make posts on social media and they would be blocked or they would be flagged. The posts may or may not be within the realm of what was going on, but if it looked like it was, or it was determined it might be, you were removed. You were warned. You were warned your account might be closed down. Uh, Private industry, such as Facebook, under the law, probably has the right to go ahead and determine what they believe free speech is. However, I would say a platform like Facebook, with billions of people, their approach should have been all speech is welcome. But they didn't take that approach, nor did at the time Twitter and TikTok and these others, where if you came out and questioned what was going on, it was censored. And at this time, a lot of people that I would say were right of center came out and screamed freedom of speech. These are infractions on our speech. We can't even talk about the other side. Is there another side? What's the truth? How does that truth uh, relevant at this time period? Are we getting the full story? Should we question the narrative? Should we be able to talk to each other about this stuff? Where does all of this play out during this time period? Now, of course, I've got the fortune to look backwards and see a lot of stuff we didn't know at that time. So I'm trying to bring you to the time period where we didn't know this was going on. We may have a doctor that had a opinion about this certain pandemic that maybe didn't coincide with what we were being told and they were blocked. We couldn't even get that opinion. I think I deserved that opinion because I think as a human being of the United States, I want to hear these different thought processes because I believe I'm responsible enough to handle the information and sort through it. Is all the information true or relevant? I don't know. I wanted to be able to find that information, but couldn't a lot of times. Google was blocking. So even our main search engines where maybe we could reach out into the internet and find this information were also limiting what we could find and what we could discuss. We know that Canada took a very extreme approach to free speech. They actually locked people out of their banks. They shut the trucker movement down. And that's just north of us. We know Australia did the same thing. And the thing that started to bother me the most was these were the countries that were supposedly the most free countries, the Western world. Europe was having a campaign and continues to have a campaign on stomping out free speech, whether it's a meme that might offend or whether or not it's something they feel isn't accurate, despite maybe it is. One example of that would be, where did our virus come from? On one side, we were being told it was from a wet market. There were a lot of people coming out stating it absolutely could not have been a wet market. It had to be this lab. There's a lot of evidence to back that. But we couldn't really find that evidence easily. The average person not trying to dig for it, not reading certain things, would have thought it came from a wet market. That's what we were told. That was the narrative. But we couldn't even see if the narrative stuck. It became very difficult to traverse the information, as what I see, free speech was trampled in this country. Why does this matter today? To you and to me? Because the people that at that time were on this side of the story, the ones that were trying to post on social media that maybe there's another solution here. Maybe the vaccine doesn't work. Maybe we've got data showing it doesn't work, but we can't post it. So the only data you could get showed it did work. It's perfectly safe. But if you had data that said maybe it wasn't safe and questioned that, you couldn't post it. So that group of people had "Don't Trample Me" flags, the United States flag in the back. They were advocating for free speech, and I was advocating for free speech. I was very vocal during this time period because I thought it was important to understand that if this is the way the government is going to treat us, then that is a very slippery slope into what could become far worse in the future. This group of people, this free speech movement, this small government movement, were advocating what I thought was correct, which is no limit to free speech. Hate speech, love speech, it didn't matter. The fact is, we can choose to ignore speech, but once it's taken away from us, whether it's through technology or through being shut down through movements, then we lose it all. And this then becomes a two-sided story. And the reason I say that is, fast forwards through the Biden administration, we find out that social media giants, such as Facebook, actually gave backdoor access to the federal government to determine what was being seen by the public. Now, during the unprecedented times, I would have thought had the founding fathers felt like unprecedented times would require us to not have free speech, they probably would have been some sort of like amendment that said that, right? It would have been, the amendment says, you have the right to free speech, except during unprecedented times, such as pandemics, such as war, right? They would have had these nuances built into the Constitution. We were told that unprecedented times required us to give us up our right to free speech. Misinformation was not allowed. The problem is the government determined what misinformation was, which now we know wasn't misinformation. There was a lot of truths out there, such as this didn't come from a wet market, this came from a lab, that the vaccine maybe isn't totally safe, but that was squashed, that we have this thing called free speech and they want us to believe that, but if it doesn't quite go along with the narrative, we'll just call it unprecedented times and we're going to go ahead and limit what you think that free speech should be. So we either have to agree in this moment that free speech is free and it's all speech, even if we don't like it. Or we have to state that there's limitations to this free speech, and that limitation is going to be determined by somebody in government. Now, that sounds great when the government maybe is on your side, because maybe, honestly, you don't love what your government has to say when it's the other side of the coin. Not a big fan of what they say. But when our person's there, and your person's not, well, now free speech can be a little bit more limited. If you go against what we believe, then we want to stop that. Where does that lead us? Well, sadly, it leads us down this road where now we have two fractions of society once again, that those that were for free speech are now not necessarily for free speech. And those that were not for free speech all of a sudden find this thing called the First Amendment. Those on my Facebook feed that were definitely against me having free speech during the pandemic All of a sudden, when I posted about Jimmy Kimmel and thinking that this was a bad scenario for licensing to be threatened because of what Jimmy Kimmel said, those people agreed with me. They were 100% on board. You can't do that. That's not allowed. It's free speech. Jimmy Kimmel should be able to say what Jimmy Kimmel wants to say. The president and the government should not limit this under the licensing of the FCC, which I wholeheartedly agree with. They shouldn't do that. Can they? I suppose. Except legally, not really. Because the government is limited on what it can do. It's different than the private sector. After research, I got to find out that even government employees have different laws for their employment on free speech than a private citizen in a private job. So, should the FCC be leveraged in order to go after things that we don't agree with when we're that president or that person? I would say no. That's a slippery slope because at some time, some other president's going to be there and determine that maybe the airwaves for radio, conservative talk show hosts, just not saying what we really like. And so we should probably leverage those radio stations and say that is not the free speech we're talking about. It's destructive. We need to get rid of those people. They're not saying what we like. But I found out an interesting thing during this time period, during the Jimmy Kimmel deal, which was those people that defended free speech during the pandemic all of a sudden seemed much more okay with this move. They understood free speech. They openly admitted that, well, it is free speech, but look at Jimmy Kimmel. Look what he's been saying. It's ugly. He's saying ugly stuff. This was an ugly time period, and we had gone through a pretty tough show, and Jimmy Kimmel just said some stuff about Charlie Kirk that people were offended by. And then the cancellation started, which is a direct move that the left does. And yet when the left did it, the right said it was cancellation. You can't do that. Freedom of speech. So then we have to determine freedom of speech was given to us to be able to hear it all. And I think you can ignore what you don't want to hear. I think the free market will tell us whether or not Jimmy Kimmel stays on TV or not. If his ratings aren't good, ABC probably isn't going to keep him. However, don't we have the right to listen to what Jimmy Kimmel says if we want to, regardless of how ugly it is? Now, does ABC have the right to fire Jimmy Kimmel over free speech? Yes. It's a private entity. He signed a contract. If his ratings are terrible or he says stuff that reflects poorly, ABC can do that. I agree with that. I don't agree that the government can force ABC to do that via the FCC or anything else that might have been going on, such as allowing or not allowing mergers to happen, which was another thing that was going on. These kind of things really make me question a lot of other things, which was, look how tribal we are as humans. My team versus your team. Denver Broncos versus the Raiders. Chevy versus Ford. Is the question whether or not free speech matters, or does it matter, but we're so tribal that once the coin flips, all of a sudden it's fine to do what the other team did? I've had a lot of conversations about this, and one of the excuses has been they've been doing it the whole time. It's just our chance to get back at them. That's also easy to say, and I get that feeling. Because when you're wronged for many, many years, decades, you want to correct that. You're like, I'm just going to get them back. But I think it would be better to take the high road and continue to fight for what we believe in, which is the Constitution. Look, I'm not a big fan of Jimmy Kimmel, but if Jimmy Kimmel wants to go out and say some ugly stuff, I'm just not going to watch him. That came with the freedom of speech, was the freedom not to listen. I can say a lot of silly stuff. I can be punished for it. Somebody might not like it. They might not buy stuff from me. They might not visit my business. You run the risk of saying some stuff. However, all sides should want freedom of speech because just like we find out during the Biden administration that freedom of speech was important so we could get the full story or be able to access the full amount of information for the pandemic, I think it's important that we also have the other side of the coin, leaving no question that we're getting what we need to get and ignoring what we want to ignore. The founding fathers were very smart. When they wrote the Constitution, they themselves knew that there were pandemics. They knew there were wars. They had just gotten done fighting one. But there was nothing under the First Amendment that started to give them ways out of the First Amendment, because they knew that government of ours was going to eventually become an issue. They were going to try to limit that. And once you limited free speech, the rest collapsed relatively quickly. If you can't have discourse, then what? We're seeing this creep into society more and more, and that's why I bring this up. I believe that we need to be careful, because the more we allow censorship into our lives, the more the government's going to do it. It's going to be on your phone. It's going to be on social media. Are we going to get social scores where if we say something somebody doesn't like, they can give us a 2-star on a personal human being, and all of a sudden I can't do something I wanted to do? It's what China does. And I don't want to be China. I don't think you want to be China. What I do think is the federal government's just simply too big, and they tend to ignore the stuff they want to ignore when the person in power is doing what that person in power does. I heard a quote one time, and I thought it was great. Ultimately, men are bad, so we need government. And ultimately, men are bad, so we need small government. Ultimately, the founding fathers knew the further away it got and the bigger it got, the harder government was to control. Whether it was free speech or any of our other First Amendment, Second Amendments, or constitutional rights, they knew the writing was on the wall, that a government ran by men who, by nature, are evil, and therefore we would have to be careful to limit them. It's also the reason that we found out that the Constitution protected the individual. Never said anything about the common good. I think that's important. It wasn't freedom of speech was squashed because they didn't like what you said. If you remember during the pandemic, it was freedom of speech is squashed because of the common good. We can't have this stuff out there. It's about the common good. And the minute we go down the path of the common good, well, then every one of our constitutional rights starts to look pretty weak, because it was never about the common good. It's about you and me. That if we always protected the individual, then the common good couldn't outvote a certain part of the common good and wipe them out. We should always want to protect the Constitution, and we should always want to protect our First Amendment rights, regardless of what's being said. Even if it's ugly, you can just walk away. Choose to do it different. Choose not to listen. Close your social media. Don't watch that show. Don't watch that anchor. Don't watch me. But be able to say what you want to say. Does that make sense to everybody? Because if so, then we've started this out on the right foot. And I am hoping that this leads to better things. Because as I am learning this stuff, as I research this stuff, it's opening my eyes. And I think the best society is the freest society. With freedom comes responsibility, and a lot of people are scared of that. But the fact of the matter is, the responsibility allows us to be a free nation. That's important. And the First Amendment gives us the absolute right to say what we want to say. I appreciate you stopping in and taking a listen. Until next time.